Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bible Study Live. We're so glad you're here with us. We're going to be discussing Psalm 18 today. So before we dive into that, I'll just ask that everyone introduces themselves. If you're joining us online, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as well. But I'm Peter. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator here at Transmission Ministry Collective.
And my name is Micah Melody. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at TMC. And as a fair warning, my voice is sore or is hoarse after recovering from a cold or flu or something. So if you hear me with a scratchy voice, that's what's going on.
Keep the tea coming.
Yes, there will be tea.
And I'm Mac. My pronouns are he, him. And yeah, I just volunteer to be here. So it's good to be back.
You also have, a bit of expertise as well in this area.
Right. Almost a PhD in New Testament studies. We're getting there.
Yeah. How close are you at this point?
This summer, I will defend this summer and be done. Wow. I have a full draft written. So
that's really exciting.
Incredible.
Yeah.
I'm so ready to be done.
Yeah.
I hear that. And it looks like we have Amber and Amory and AJ and Jamie in the chat. And Isabel as well. Welcome in. All right. Well, as we get started with, as usual, the way we usually do this is we will read through the text. We've kind of broken it up into certain sections. And we'll read through those sections, those verses like section by section, and then we'll get into conversation about our observations. And feel free to put in the chat, feel free to put in your own kind of questions and observations as well as we're reading through. And then we'll kind of close out with our kind of concluding thoughts. So did anyone have any background or anything that you wanted to add on this text before we start?
I think the little prologue, attribution, whatever it is at the beginning of the psalm, there's a word for it. I don't remember what it is, but I think that's helpful just because it kind of gives us a little bit of context. So I'll read that for us real quick. I'm reading out of the KJV tonight because whenever I'm reading out of Psalms, I'm reading out of the KJV tonight. So that's just how I work. But to the chief musician, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spake unto the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. I think that's helpful background information because Saul, referring to King Saul, who was the first king of Israel and directly before David, they had a rough relationship. Despite being David's father-in-law, spent a lot of time trying to kill him. And so I think that is important background of just like, who are these enemies? And for David, they were people who were really close to him and family kind of. And so I think that's helpful background for the struggles that we see David going through in this one. Spoiler alert, it's a rough time.
Well, and this is also like before David sort of like stepped into his role as king and was, in a position of power himself. Like he was very much at this point, like kind of an enemy of the state, right? And so like that relationship to power is an interesting one, I feel like, in the context of this psalm.
Yeah, I think also too, thanks for reading that and bringing that up. And also, Mac, that's a very interesting kind of, like you said, David's enemies being people that he's close to, right? Like that's an interesting perspective that, I think often when I've read this passage, it's like, or this psalm, it's often thinking about this in the abstract or, but also what that is like for, I think also maybe some of us can relate to having family members or people that we're close to who are doing things or advocating for things that are harmful to our well-being. I definitely can right now. And so I think that's another helpful context and way to relate to the passage.
Well, and, sort of by way of background too, one of the reasons we chose this psalm today is specifically be like sort of to address some feelings that are going on. I think for each of us on this call and for, our community at large, of feeling beset, threatened, a lot of the sort of feelings that come up that David is experiencing in this psalm, and wanting to like draw comfort from, God's deliverance as it's sort of expressed here. I did a little research on this psalm like we usually do before these Bible studies, and I couldn't find a lot sort of theologically or like analysis or commentary about it. And really that wasn't why it drew me in. It's more like the poetry of it. So I think we'll get more into that too, but just that's why I love the Psalm so much, is because they just express these emotional realities in such a compelling way.
Yeah, there's sometimes so much you can say through imagery or metaphor
Mhm.
that goes beyond what you can say through like a kind of a letter or a doctrine or
Right.
that. So there is beauty in the emotive and the metaphorical as well.
Mhm.
And they're not just the emotions that we feel like are okay. These ones are allowed. I'm allowed to express these thoughts and feelings to God.
Mhm.
These ones are all the ones we're like, oh, I didn't know we were allowed to say that
Yeah.
when we were praying. Okay,
Yeah.
I like that. David gets to be angry and real, and there's nothing. It's not wrong. He can do that, and so can we, and that's always very comforting to me.
Agreed.
All right, should we jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, why don't we start with we're going to start with verses 1 through 15. So Mac, would you want to get us started with the your KJV?
Sure. Yeah, I love the poetry of the Psalms in KJV. So here we are. Verse 1. I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation, and my high tower. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. The sorrows of death encompassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell encompassed me about. The snares of death prevented me. In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even to his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken, because he was wroth. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down. Darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub and did fly. Yea, he did fly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion round about him were dark waters, and thick clouds of the skies. At the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed, hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Yea, he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and he shot out lightnings and discomfited them. Then the channels of waters were seen, and the foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke, O Lord, and at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils.
That is very poetic and quite different. There's some interesting differences.
Yes, there are.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, before we kind of get into different observations. Also, feel free to post in the chat if you're reading from a different translation and you notice the difference that was interesting to you. Feel free to post that in the chat. But one of the things that just really stuck out to me was how different verse 4 is from what you read to the NRSV. Because in the NRSV, it's the cords of death encompassed me, the torrents of perdition assailed me. Versus what did you read again?
The sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. So I'm about to go look at Hebrew and see if we can find something here.
Yeah, I'm really curious here.
Yeah.
Let's see what we can find here. What are we translating as ungodly men? Okay. Oh, interesting. Give me a second. Let's see. The word is Belial, which I think a lot of people would recognize, because it's often like a stand-in name for Satan. Sometimes is Belial.
Mhm.
So sometimes it's just transliterated as Belial, but it also like wickedness or wicked, ungodly, evil, ruin, destruction. So the idea of perdition is interesting.
It's because perdition being like hell, eternal punishment, unrepentance, and so it's there is that connection there to ungodliness, but perdition is like feels you've taken ungodly to like a whole other level.
Yeah,
and
I almost wonder. No, go ahead. Finish. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm actually not really a fan of that translation, given the original Hebrew.
I'm almost wondering if it's because, like, as a translation thing, I'm wondering if they will go with perdition because the next verse in NRSV you get Sheol, and then in the KJV you get hell, which is not uncommon in the KJV. That's like that makes sense. But I wonder if because they go with Sheol there, because that's a more true translation, they felt like they were losing that sort of hell concept, and so they brought it in the verse before, even though I don't think that necessarily makes sense.
Yeah, there is that imagery of ensnaring or entrapping with the cords of Sheol and the snares of death. So I think, yeah, but it is interesting. Anyway, that was a little bit of a translation tangent because those are always fascinating.
They're so fun.
Yeah. Any other things really standing out to people, or any other kind of either interesting translation differences or just things that you're observing in these verses?
Well, in that same verse, I mean, I'm actually interested by that translation difference and like going back to that original word, because I think this feels like the like going back to the poetry again, it feels like so relentless here. Like the cords of death encompassed me, the torrents of perdition assailed me, the cords of Sheol entangled me. There's this like repetition in those lines in their structure, and it just kind of feels like it just keeps coming. And that word that's being translated as perdition also seems like it has a sense of sort of hopelessness to it, of like, we can't get free from this. This is eternal punishment, or this is something that we'll never escape from, and like that's how it feels to me. Like that section, it just conveys that really viscerally, of like that feeling of, I feel like I can't get out of this. I feel like I can't escape from these attacks that keep coming.
I just saw what Amory put in the chat. The breakers, this is the RSV, the breakers of death rolled over me, and the torrents of oblivion made me afraid. Ooh. Which is kind of really getting at what you're talking about, Peter, of that kind of overwhelm. It's almost this hopelessness, absolute kind of terror and fear, and yeah, that's really intense.
Yeah, the breakers of death rolled over me is great. Effective. Not great. I don't really want the breakers of death to roll over me, but it gets the point across.
Yeah. Something I like about it is you do get this very intense image of having a really, really rough time, but like this is considered a psalm of victory. So I like the fact that even though like there's so much confidence here in the victory and the salvation, there's no sort of retroactively, but it wasn't that bad. Because I think that there can often be a tendency of like, once you make it through something, you're like, well, it wasn't that bad to begin with. That's probably overreacting. But no, it's like, no, it was that bad. It was terrible. The grave was chasing me down. Everything was bad. and I still made it. I appreciate the realness of that there's no need to be like, and this was nothing. Made it through and everything's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can often feel like we're overreacting to, the things in the world that, we were kind of talking about earlier. And so it is nice to have that sort of feeling of, no, I can like acknowledge how bad this is. This is that scary. This is, this does feel overwhelming. I don't need to pretend everything's okay all the time.
Yeah. And I really like the contrast here of the hope and the, I love the imagery in verse 2. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. That's just the rock, that the fortress. That's such protection. Like the images of just like, you go to a fortress to survive an attack or to like be protected, and so David here is kind of saying that I find this protection in God, and also I'm not going to sugarcoat the fact that this was awful, which I do think that there can be a tendency to be like, in especially in some Christian spaces that I've been in, where it's like, oh, God's got this, and like this kind of optimism of, oh, God, God's hand is in this. You don't have to worry. And it kind of erases the reality of the hardship, right? Where I think this is awful. And I also, out of that, acknowledging that, coming to honor and celebrate it and rejoice in the victory, and also put trust in God, it makes the hope and trust feel that much more like real and concrete and powerful, when you know that there is this oblivion waiting, right? So yeah.
Oh yeah, I see the comment from Tara. I do also appreciate how the psalmist doesn't minimize the struggle after the fact. I tend towards minimizing my own struggles after the fact, sort of trying to pretend I didn't have needs. Yeah, that's relatable. For sure.
Yeah. It's like that toxic positivity of, if you actually acknowledge how bad it is, did you really trust God? Like, yeah, and it still sucked. Well, I still have lots of reason to worry.
That's a really hard balance to strike too, because I have trouble sometimes with the feelings of like I can trust in God, or even some of the sort of we'll sort of sing songs at church about God keeps their promises, or God's got you, and all of those ideas can sometimes feel really hard to swallow, when it doesn't necessarily feel that way. So somehow like clinging to that without that sort of toxic positivity of like, that means everything's fine.
Yeah. I also really appreciate, oh, go ahead.
I think, holding that, you mentioned like worship songs or like singing songs in church of, how many, if we look at like CCM, right? Like contemporary Christian music, and look at the percentage of songs that are about lament versus songs that are about victory. Almost like I would love to do a study on that. I'm sure there's studies already been done, but like, it's so different when you compare that to the Psalms, like, which are also songs of worship, right? But the Psalms, if we look at the kind of context of this being in the Psalter, it follows a ton of Psalms of lament and Psalms crying for help. So it's not minimizing, it's not minimizing the hardship. And so it is I'm glad you brought that up, Peter, because that's a huge contrast.
Yeah, and there's none of the sort of like, all of this was worked out for good. There was a reason behind it all. Because I think that a lot of like the first song that pops in my head is Casting Crowns, which I know a bit old at this point, but like that song already there of like, oh, well, if I was standing where God was standing and looked back, it would all make sense and it would be beautiful and everything was like strings on an embroidery like thing. And like, no, sometimes everything is just legitimately bad. And I can still have hope and confidence in all of that, which I think is important.
Yeah, we can hold both.
Yes.
The truth can be more complex And there can be two things that are real at the same time.
Speaking of holding both, angry God.
Yes. Verses 7 through 15 are kind of intense, especially when we talk about this. One thing that's really interesting is it starts, on the NRSV, it says, then the earth reeled and rocked, and the foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked because he was angry. Like, it just straight up says, because God was angry. And it's interesting that when I was reading this is in response to verse 6, which is David crying to God to help. So like the anger of God is in response for help, to response to help. And so it's a really interesting, it just feels like an interesting tension or contrast that I don't know if I would always expect. What do y'all feel about this depiction in 7 through 15?
Gonna be honest, I love it. I love the fact that David is like, everything is terrible. I keep getting attacked. It's never ending. And God's response is, yeah, and I'm angry about it. And God comes down and does something about it. And I think that is really powerful and comforting, because I think on one hand, David's wishes for his enemies are not wishes that I would advocate for anyone else to have for their enemies. He would prefer total destruction of his enemies. I'm not on board with that. But like, feeling like God is also angry at the injustice, also looking at this and being, you're right, this is not how this is supposed to be. This is unacceptable to me. And that the whole earth feels that is just really powerful. Because I think sometimes for me, when I'm looking at like the state of the world and all of the attacks against trans people and all the uncertainties coming up, it feels very much like, is no one else worried about this? Is no one else upset about this? And so the idea that God says, no, I am, and the whole world's going to know about it, I think is just, I like it a lot.
I had the same response, which is actually kind of, I was sort of surprised by my response to that part of the psalm this time around. Because the idea of an angry God is one that has sort of also been, weaponized in my experience of faith and church. And so that's not usually how I like to think about God, the sort of wrathful God, or the God who punishes, like that's not really like an important part of my usual conception of God. But I had the same response where I was like, this is comforting, because if this is God's response to sort of the anguish of their beloved children, like the God feels this, God acts in response to this. And then also just it's a helpful expression for the anger that I feel sometimes, and that anger can be good and holy, and so the sort of drama of this response was, kind of cathartic.
Yeah. Like the accountability I want is not total destruction, but I do want accountability. And clearly that's something that matters to God too.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that it like underlines the importance of this. Like, this is how important God thinks it is when their children are being harmed, or in response to injustice.
As I'm sitting here with this, it's making me think about the contrast of where the anger is directed. Because when I hear angry God, my mind goes to Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, or the idea of this, God is angry and at like your personal sense of like this individualistic sense of sin of you are like doing things wrong, or you are not pure, I know we'll talk a little bit on purity and cleanliness a little bit later. I know a lot of trans folks, that fear of God's wrath and anger, we've been told, many of us have been told, that we are stepping, like by transitioning or being ourselves, we are stepping outside of God's love in some way, right? But this type of anger, as you're talking about it, is this like, it's a righteous anger of like overflowing of injustice, of like there's something wrong in the world. And it reminds me of the idea of the divine pathos, which is the idea of pathos being kind of the emotive sense of, or the way that God is moved by emotion, and the prophets, the way they tap into the pathos of God. Rabbi Abraham Heschel talks a lot about that in the prophets, of that they are moved. Their prophetic voice is because they are moved by the way that God is moved because of the injustice and the pain in the world. And that feels like a different type of angry God to me. I'm not sure if that's just me, but it feels like there's a distinction there. And so thank you for what you both shared, because it's helping me even make a distinction in my mind of reckoning and reconciling this passage and even finding hope in it.
Well, and another thing I'm noticing as I'm reading it again is that all of these descriptions of like how God's anger manifests are like things happening in the earth or in the environment. So there's not a lot in this particular section about like violence towards David's enemies, but I like the verse, the foundations of the world were laid bare at your rebuke. So basically, like, God goes down to the very foundations, like breaks it all down, because in order to like deliver David from this, is what it feels like. It's like it just kind of shakes up the sort of accepted nature of reality, goes all the way down to the foundations. And that just feels really powerful too, of like the type of change that's possible.
Yeah. I love what this feels very kind of like almost summarizing this from Tara. It's God being protective of God's people instead of God wielding anger against God's people. There is this anger on behalf of, not against, which I think is a great way to kind of sum that up. Also, just noting an earlier comment from Amber, for a Lament CCM song, check out Bethlehem from Semler. That's a great song, and I absolutely love that song.
Yeah, Semler's incredible.
All right. Any other final thoughts on these verses? All right. Why don't we move on to the next verses, 16 through 29. Peter, would you take these?
Yes. I'm reading from the NRSV updated edition. He reached down from on high. He took me. He drew me out of mighty waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a broad place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his ordinances were before me, and his statutes I did not put away from me. I was blameless before him and kept myself from guilt. Therefore, the Lord has recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his sight. With the loyal, you show yourself loyal. With the blameless, you show yourself blameless. With the pure, you show yourself pure. And with the crooked, you show yourself shrewd. For you deliver a humble people, but the haughty eyes you bring down. It is you who light my lamp. The Lord my God lights up my darkness. By you I can outrun a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall.
Thanks, Peter. All right. Well, what stands out to folks in these verses here?
I'm checking out a translation difference at the moment. Interesting. In 25, and we can also come back to this, where NRSV says loyal, the word hasid in KJV comes out as merciful. Which is interesting, because I wouldn't think of those as being the same.
Is there any like context for that word?
Yeah, I'm going to look it up some other places.
The BDB has it indexed as kind and pious. So it's interesting. I also wouldn't put those two together.
No, loyal doesn't. Yeah, loyal feels like a bit of a.
I think it's more loyal to me feels connected more closely to piety. But even still, that doesn't feel like a 1-to-1 there. The old. I'm also in the non-updated NRSV, and it also has loyal. That is interesting. I noticed a translation difference actually between the NRSV and the NRSV UE in verse 26. I think you said, "And with the crooked you show yourself." What is it? Shrewd.
Shrewd, yeah.
Here it's with the crooked you show yourself perverse.
Oh.
Which
this was one of the lines that when I was like flipping through different translations was the most different. I feel like there were lots of different versions of this. With the crooked you show yourself shrewd.
I think there is a way of like, it's the loyal is loyal, blameless to blameless, pure to pure, and then there is a shift that's happening just from the poetic flow. There is like, so it's like returning in kind, except when there is something that's happening that's unjust. So it's interesting.
Yeah, KJV uses froward, which who knows what that means, but it uses it for both. So it's an exact parallel.
Are they different? Two different words in the original?
Yes, they are.
I don't have it open. Interesting. Again, I don't know what any of that means, but I do think it's very cool.
Yes, it is really interesting. Also, Tara noted that it's faithful. I think, are you talking about verse 25, loyal? Loyal is translated as faithful in the NIV. And then Amory says, the RSV says, with the crooked, you are wily. I like that a lot.
Really like that. I actually kind of like shrewd too, but wily I think I like even better. It reminds me of the sort of wise as serpents, we're supposed to be wise as serpents. So it's okay to be a little, wily in response to injustice.
I love that. Translation. That's fun.
I feel like I need to read the RSV more. I don't, and I've been enjoying all of these, so I feel like I need to read the RSV more.
Yeah. Well, going back up to the top in verses like 16 through 19, I love the poetic nature of how active God's actions are. He reached down, he took me, he drew me out, he delivered me. There in verses 16 and 17. And I think there is like, I love how active this is. Like it's there's active participation by God.
I love in verse 19. I will never get sick of any verse that says God, because he delights in me. I just think that is so good. And I know we'll talk about, the cleanness and the purity and how all that plays into it too. But I love the fact that before we get to all of that, God delivers me because he delighted in me. And I think I have been told many, many, many times that I've disappointed God and God's heartbroken about who I am and how I'm living and all of these things. And so whenever, especially when I think about David and his life and where he's going, because we have the benefit of having, more of the story than he does at this point in his life. Like I love that even if I can't say like, oh I've done nothing wrong ever, like I don't think God's delight in me changes. It's the idea that God is angry at my oppression and angry at the oppression of my community and all of the others who are being beaten down by injustice, because God delights in us, is just so powerful. And I think it's really, really important for us to remember that like God cherishes us and delights in us and wants good things for us, and we are important to God. because we don't get told that enough.
Mm-hmm.
I love this comment from Tara. This is beautiful. God finds joy in me. I see comparison of finding joy being important in hard times to fuel us. It's important to delight in the good, even for God.
Mm-hmm.
Which is really, really, that's really powerful and a beautiful sentiment of God delighting in us. And that's an important act for God and for us, but also for God.
Well, and that's God's, like you were saying, Mike, that's God's motivation for, again, we're not hearing a lot about the enemies. There are lots of Psalms where we hear a lot about the enemies being brutally destroyed. We're not hearing a lot about that in this section, though. It's really, we hear a lot about how it feels, like how the attack feels to the person being attacked. And then we hear about God, taking this powerful action on their behalf. And the motivation behind that is God's delight, and it's different than the motivation is God hates the people who are, attacking me.
Yeah. And, to connect that to what we were talking about earlier in the concept of purity, cleanliness and stuff, that, verse 19 is followed by the verses 20 through 24. The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanliness of my hand, he recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed. There's also in 23, I was blameless before him and I kept myself from guilt. So I was like, at least in part, there is this kind of delight that David is connecting also to this kind of keeping the way of God and this righteousness and also the cleanliness and the purity. And that was hard for me as I was reading that, because I know that so often that has been told to me and many other trans folks about we are our purity, our worth to God is based on our actions or what we do to please God. And so I was kind of wrestling a little bit with that tension between I love because he delighted in me, and then immediately it follows up with this. And so I'm feeling this tension here. And I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on this tension.
Yeah. Go ahead, Peter.
I don't like the language of clean, or purity. Like that's just been used in so many harmful ways that it really, even as a metaphor, doesn't feel like it has much to offer at this point, for me at least. But I there's something in this section that also feels like it's talking about how we hold on to our values even when we're being attacked, and we don't adopt our enemy's tactics, and we it is possible to do that. And so it feels like it could also be read as being kind of about that, of like, I didn't despite the fact that I was being sort of, attacked from every side, I didn't lose sight of my relationship to God. I didn't lose sight of my worth in God's eyes. I didn't lose sight of the things that I know to be true about myself and about God. And so that feels like a reading that can resonate for me.
I like that a lot. I think for me also, there's a bit of this feeling of like, I do not think that David, even at this point in his life, is blameless. Like, he's a person. And so I also kind of think of it as, rather than looking kind of what we were talking about, like not at the individual sins, like we all do a bunch of stuff all the time, but more, instead like looking at us like as a whole, as holistically, when God looks at me, I am good. And sort of rejecting this idea that I am unclean. Like, no, God looks at me and I am good, is I think really powerful for me, at least, because I don't feel like it's saying like, no, if I could look through every single, if we roll the tape, I'm perfect and I know it, and that is why God loves me. Instead, I think of it as like, no, when God looks at me, I am good, and God delights in me, even with all of the things that come along with being a human. That doesn't reduce that worth, like you were saying, Peter.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is kind of making me kind of go back to even some of the connotations and the difference in language that we have for things like righteousness. In Hebrew, it's tzedek, right, which is also justice, right? So righteousness is not disconnected from justice in the gate. It's not disconnected from doing the right thing in the broader context of community. Where I think a lot of times when, at least in a lot of more conservative American Christianity, to be righteous is to be morally upright internally for self, right? The sense of, I don't lie, I don't, like these types of things, which are certainly can be part of righteousness, but there is also kind of a more holistic, as you were talking about, Mac, that's more holistic dimension to what righteousness means in this particular context too. That definitely doesn't come across in some of our English connotations of the word.
Yeah, my pastor always says that righteousness means right relationship, which I always find to be a really compelling sort of definition of that word, is like being in right relationship to yourself, to God, to your community. And so it's that takes it, sort of removes it a bit from the sort of connotations of like cleanness or purity, and more about like who we are in relationship to each other.
I see Amber says, if purity feels like a concept that we've lost the definition for. And I would probably, I think, yeah, a lot of these concepts, the definitions of words change so much over time and the connotation will change. And so also too, remembering that translation is interpretation, because there is no one-to-one way that we can take a cultural concept and replicate it in a different language. We can get close, but they're, especially over long periods of time. Yeah, I think those are really kind of helpful ways of looking at that. And I like and something you said earlier, Mac, even before we get to this, before we get to the righteousness that God, the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness, even before we get to that, David says first, he brought me out of into a broad place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. That's like what comes first. And then there is that kind of righteous connection underneath it. So it's, I do really love the ordering of that. Before we move on to kind of the last section here, I did want to highlight, there's a lot in here that we haven't even talked about in this section. But there is a verse that I wanted to highlight, and it's verse 27, because it really jumped out at me. For you deliver a humble people, but the haughty eyes you bring down. And to me, that feels so inverted from the way the world kind of expects things to work, right? Like that if you kind of this, if you express humility and are kind of more meek, or that there is this expectation of like, you won't get as far as if you are kind of like assertive and kind of claiming what's yours. And this, especially within our US system of kind of meritocracy, this idea of like the way you have to claim things that are yours. And it really reminded me of the Beatitudes in like Matthew 5, specifically kind of the Beatitudes of like, blessed are those who are meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who are pure in heart, they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. So it's like this inversion of what is to be expected. And I really, really appreciated that kind of coming across in the Psalm.
Yeah, it reminds me too of the Bible study lab we did recently on the Magnificat too. And that sort of the reversal of the power dynamic, or the reversal of expectation of kind of, yeah, like what is admirable, or what should be saved, or
All right. Any other final thoughts on this section before we move to the last one? All right. So we're going to move to verses 30 through 36. And just to acknowledge, this isn't the end of the Psalm. It continues on. But it's a little bit too long to try to, we're barely going to be able to tackle 36 verses in this hour. So let me go ahead and read that for us. This God, his way is perfect. The promise of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all who take refuge in him. For who is God except the Lord, and who is a rock besides our God? The God who girded me with strength and made my way safe. He made my feet like the feet of a deer and set me secure on the heights. He trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your right hand has supported me. Your help has made me great. You gave me a wide place for my steps under me, and my feet did not slip. All right. Well, what stands out to folks in this section?
I mean, I have always loved, he made my feet like the feet of a deer and set me secure on the heights. There's lots of different translations of that I've heard, but he made my feet like the feet of a hind. I don't know why that, for some reason, that I think I just have this image in my head of like sort of like a mountain dwelling deer, like leaping from rock to rock. And there's kind of this like joy and freedom in that, in a really sort of treacherous situation. You're kind of nimble and you've got this security, even though, it looks like the path is so dangerous. And I don't know, that just, I really like the poetry of that line a lot.
Yeah, when I read that, I don't know if you know what a klipspringer is. They're like these tiny little, like they're basically deer, but they're these tiny little deer-like creatures that they like jump from rock to rock, but they have these like hooves that allow them to anchor in. And it's really cool to watch. So if you haven't ever looked up a klipspringer, you should totally do it.
Look that up for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting we have a lot of translation differences today, but an interesting one is that word help in verse 35. I've got gentleness for that. Or humility, meekness. And one, I think what you were just talking about in that previous section about delivering a humble people, I think that's an interesting connection. If you use like a humility, a meekness, a gentleness in there, I think that's interesting. And I also think it's a fascinating juxtaposition between the angry God whose righteous anger like shakes the foundations of the world, and God's gentleness has made me great. Is I think I really like this idea that God gets angry at injustice, but is also gentle toward us. And it's kind of like what Tara was saying, not directed toward the people, but angry on behalf of people is, I think, really powerful. And I think that it's nice to know that, context makes a difference. Sometimes anger is the appropriate response, and sometimes it's gentleness. I think it's nice.
That's a fascinating translation difference.
Mm-hmm.
I did notice that there was a little note next to it, and it says "or gentleness," which again, I'm like really curious. Why?
How do we get help?
Yeah.
Yeah. That one's really interesting to me, because like the other place it's used, like Psalm 45:4, I want to see what that is in NRSV, because in KJV again it's meekness. So I'm curious what is in that one.
Yeah, it seems
it up right now.
Translating it as help seems to lose a lot of
It does.
connotation.
45:4, in your majesty, write on victoriously for the cause of truth and to defend, that's where it is, the right. Let your right hand teach you dread deeds. So
I'm gonna have to dig more into that, because I'm so interested on how we got there.
Yeah. And it, again, the note says, and the meekness of. So there is a kind of a similar note that's being made there.
Wow.
That one's just fascinating to me. I have no idea what it means. I don't know how we got there, but I think it's cool.
Yeah.
That would be an interesting thing to dive into. Oh.
When I finish this dissertation.
Dissertation number 2, like looking at the
me adding it to my list and be like, I'm done with Greek for a while. Back to Hebrew we go.
I really also like this the assurance of, as you were talking about, Peter, this kind of security of steps. Like in this image of the deer, and also in 36, you gave me a wide place for my steps under me, and my feet did not slip. There is this kind of continued image of being able to be sure in where you're moving and where you're walking, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Good.
Go ahead, Mac.
Just gonna say, with like the wide place and the but there was the first one earlier of like giving me like a space or something.
Yeah, he brought me into a broad place.
Yeah, I like both of those because God's giving David some space to breathe. Because we were saying earlier, it feels like all of those things are coming and they're not stopping, and there's no, like, everything is encompassed around me and I'm surrounded and I'm prevented. And then God takes you out of that and gives you some room to breathe. And I feel like so often that is what I wish for, is I need some space to breathe.
Yeah, similarly.
I wanted to highlight a couple comments in the chat. Amber says, the imagery of 36 evokes skateboarding for me. A wider board is more stable and easier to maneuver.
Oh, I love that.
That's great.
Uh-huh.
God gave me a wide board.
Yeah.
Yes. That's the skateboarding translation.
Yeah. Perfect.
Great. And then Tara says, while I don't like the militaristic imagery of verse 34, I do like the idea it conveys of God strengthening the psalmist to prepare them. Which I think is, I think, again, I think, we're within a context where war is kind of a normal thing and an expected thing. And so writing within that, the imagery of it, there is this preparation and readiness. Also, bending a bow of bronze is pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's some superhuman kind of stuff.
Any other final thoughts on this section?
I'm going to have to go look at bend too, because here it's broken, which is different. Breaking a bow is different than bending it to shoot it. So I'm also interested in that. So I'm going to look that one up too, but I'll do that another day.
Yeah. That is interesting. And I just did a cursory glance because I can't help it. And there's a lot there. So that will be an interesting rabbit hole to go down. All right. Well, why don't we kind of wrap this up as we and move to just some kind of takeaways for us. So what are one thing that you're kind of taking away from our conversation and from this passage?
I think for me, it's the most important parts of this one for me are that God not just cares, because that doesn't feel strong enough, but God is moved to, is passionate about protecting God's children and not even just defending, but just in solidarity of like, I'm angry too. And like, you are safe and you are secure in my delight in you is, I think, really, really powerful to me.
How about you, Peter?
One of the ideas that is sticking with me is that idea of space that we were just talking about at the end, or like these broad places that God brings us to, and the like kind of feeling our feet under us, when like there's such a feeling of sort of instability right now. So like coming back to that grounding feels really important. So those images I think are going to stick with me.
The wide board.
The wide board.
Love that.
Mm-hmm.
I just noting something that Amory is putting in there. Your loving care makes me great. Loving care is what makes people great in God's eyes. God's power is gentle and humble, which I think is beautiful. I think for me, my takeaway is really that we can hold security and find confidence in God and hope in God, find protection in God. And also that doesn't mean that we deny the reality of what we're going through, and that we can hold both at the same time. And that it's that I think even when we acknowledge that reality and we kind of recognize how truly bad it actually can and is, that actually makes that hope even stronger. And I think that's something that I'm going to be taking away from this. And then I just, last couple comments in the chat. Tara says, God delights in us and is moved to act on our behalf and strengthen us and sets us in broad places. We don't have to face everything alone and without help. And AJ says, God is acting like how the best sort of ally acts, swooping in to have your back and to make sure that you have your space to live and act, which I think is a really beautiful place to kind of close this out. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We are, in terms of announcements, our next Bible Study Live will be on March 19th. Is there any other announcements that we have, Peter?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next month.